also at least be open to the possibility that that worldview was an ideological construct, as opposed to some kind of like rational reaction to reality. And so before we get into that, given that I just came out of an economic history conference, let me just like briefly discuss some of the alternative explanations that have been thrown out there for the unusually small size of the fiscal state. For the past several decades, nearly all of these explanations have been thrown out by various kinds of economists or people with a certain kind of economic sympathy, which means that they tend to be what you might call kind of like economically rationalists. They tend to assume rational self-interested behavior from various kinds of political actors, and then they build them into various kinds of models. So these explanations fall pretty much into three major categories. Like the first category basically is a demand side explanation, which basically argues that because the Qing, for example, fought fewer wars and was more peaceful than, for example, its European peers, it had less need to actually raise taxes. And for long periods of the dynasty, it didn't have to raise taxes at all. So the idea is that there was actually no demand to raise taxes across the Qing. Now, I think this is wrong in one obvious context, which is post-1840, the Qing begins fighting as many wars as pretty much any regime on earth. And even after 1840, from the Opium Wars all the way into the Taiping Rebellion to the later waves of wars with European powers or wars with Japan, it never tries to raise agricultural taxes. When it gets into fiscal crises during these military campaigns, it raises non-agricultural taxes incredibly aggressively, but it never touches this one sacred cow, which is the agricultural tax. It's not until the final decade of the dynasty when the state is pretty much completely broke in the wake of Shimonoseki and in the wake of the Boxer Rebellion that the state finally begins to touch the sacred cow, and then that triggers a series of cascade effects. So, if you think that there's no demand before 1840, then at least you can't think that there was no demand for for more taxes post 1840. But the state's behavior post 1840 still falls into this category of like it's just categorically refuses to raise agricultural taxes. And even prior to 1840, I mean, the thing is, the Qing is not exactly a non-militaristic regime for pretty much its first 150 years. Right? It fights major wars against its own feudatories. It fights major campaigns in the West. It goes into Tibet. It goes into Xinjiang, conquers all these places, wages war in Mongolia against a variety of powers. This is a militarily active Central Asian empire, as many people have documented. So, and those, like during those campaigns, which often put the state under some kind of fiscal stress, they also only basically try to fund those campaigns through, if at all, through tax increases to non-agricultural production or commerce. And agricultural taxes were never really touched. And even during the supposedly peaceful periods, peaceful 60 years of 1780 to 1840, smack in the middle of that, around 1800, there was the White Lotus Rebellion, which actually also put major strain on the Qing state's finances and prompts like a major rethink internally of how much it can actually afford to run its usual operations, given its current tax base. So it's not, I don't think it's true at all that the Qing state was not under, substantial financial duress at various multiple points in its pre-1840 history. And post-1840, those pressures go to like the 11th degree and begin to escalate far beyond the capacity of the state to actually fund them. So they have to raise taxes. And when they do so, they just adamantly refuse to touch the agricultural tax. Now, the second category of explanations is that, okay, fine, the Qing state might have had some kind of demand, some kind of need to raise taxes, but it didn't actually have the supply capacity to raise taxes on the rural population. Now, this comes in less sophisticated and more sophisticated terms. The more sophisticated kind is, for example, a series of articles written by either Jared Rubin and Dobin Ma, and also like Tang He-sing and Shakti Moriguchi, which basically argues that the core problem with the Qing was that it was too large, right? Like as you get too large, the principal agent problems of the empire escalate beyond a certain proportion, and that causes more corruption, which means that like the average amount of corrupt illegal surcharges that local agents are going to collect on top of formal official quotas increases as your empire expands. And if you want to make sure that you don't overtax your population, you can't expand your tax base as much as your population economy expands. You always have to expand at a slower pace if you want to keep the rate stable. So I think that's a very powerful model that explains a lot of behavioral tendencies, especially in non-agricultural taxes. But for agricultural taxes, the curious thing is the model doesn't actually predict complete stagnation in taxes. It predicts a lower rate of growth than the economy and the population, which means that tax rates go down over time, but the absolute size of fiscal intake does not necessarily have to stagnate. And whereas what you actually see in the agricultural tax context is that the absolute volume is locked, and the tax rate just plummets because the actual volume of taxation never grows, even when the population and the economy are tripling. So I think it's a very useful explanation. It just happens to be a little bit incomplete. Plus, if that's the explanation, you also can't really explain the differential treatments of agricultural versus non-agricultural taxes, because that explanation applies perhaps equally to both of these things. And as I argue in some detail in the book, it might actually apply to non-agricultural taxes even more aggressively than to agricultural taxes. So in that case, if both of these things are under this kind of supply side pressure, then why is only one treated as this sacred cow and the other is actually treated as pretty much a cash cow that you can constantly abuse and tax when you actually need to? Now, the final explanation is, so for example, my friend Yuhua Wang at Harvard has this new book out that basically argues that it really wasn't either supply or demand, it was the self-interest of the political elites. And elites themselves also don't really want to be taxed. Right? And as their influence over time grows, and as the overall structure of power politics in this thing gets more localized, over time, the ability of the state to actually tax the rural population falls and disintegrates. Now, again, I think this is also one of those explanations that is quite powerful and explains a lot of things, but it can't really explain the entire picture, and especially it can't really explain the differential treatment between agricultural taxes and non-agricultural taxes, because if elites had any kind of interest in not taxing agriculture, not having land taxed, they probably had an even stronger kind of self-interest in not having commerce tax, because by the 1800s, certainly most Qing elites were more invested in commerce than land. So I think all of these explanations are useful in certain amounts and powerful in a lot of ways, but they're all kind of incomplete in ways that beg further explanation. Now, the further explanation can come in a form of kind of early generation ideological argument that you see in certain kinds of Qing historians, Matty Zeldin, Bill Rose, Susan Mann, so on and so forth, who all kind of argue that the main problem with the Qing taxes, why they were so low, was that the Qing was a Confucian dynasty, and there is a Confucian ideological bias against taxing agriculture, especially against taxing farmers and peasants. Now, this is in absolute terms kind of true. There are Confucian ideological maxims going all the way back to Confucius himself that say that you should be careful of the state should never compete for profit with its population, and that the virtuous person should never speak of profit, and so on and so forth. Now, the problem with this kind of argument is that, the Qing was a Confucian dynasty in some perhaps not so obvious fashion. But the thing is, so were all the previous dynasties, right? If the Qings had Confucian, and so was the Ming, so was the Song, and so was the Tang. And the thing is, that kind of Confucian maximum never stopped any of these dynasties from raising agricultural taxes when they actually had to. So if it's just Confucianism all the way down, then why did fiscal behavior become so much more conservative in this final dynasty? So what actually changed in the Qing? And so here I'm just going to give like a 10-minute summary of basically the argument of the book, and just leave it there and open up for questions, because we can tease out more of the mechanisms in the actual Q&A session. So the argument of the book basically is this, right? So I think it was ideology, but it's not just a simple Confucian ideology as hostile to taxation kind of thing. The nature of the ideology, the nature of the elite hostility towards taxation changes quite a lot between Ming and Qing. And the way you observe this is if you look at late Ming documents, right? Things like essays in the Huangmingjing Shibenbian, for example, on why did they not want to like, when Zhang Zhuzheng was trying to raise taxes in the late Ming, and when the late Ming government was trying to impose all these military campaign taxes on the population in the early 17th century, if you were a fiscal conservative court and you wanted to argue against this, you basically made the following argument, right? We think, we good Confucians think that taxing more heavily is morally problematic. Now, we think it's just morally wrong. It goes against all kinds of institutional precedents set by your ancestors. It's unfilial. It's unbenevolent. It's benevolent. It speaks poorly of your moral character. It speaks poorly of our moral character. We can't have this happen. Then we also suspect that if you do this, things are, at some point, the peasants are going to run out of patience with you, and they might rebel. But the problem with, for them was that at that point in time, they didn't really have a super salient example of, a super salient empirical example of what exactly would happen if you raise taxes, because it had been quite a long time since the last major peasant rebellion. In their minds, the uprisings that destroyed the Mongol Yuan dynasty didn't actually count, because they counted that as just like the Han Chinese rising up against the Mongols in their minds. What was the previous major peasant rebellion that seriously threatened the dynasty? It was like the Huangchao Huangxianzhi rebellions all the way back in the late Tang, and those didn't actually kill off the dynasty. They weakened it, and then the dynasty collapsed later on to powerful military warlords. So they couldn't actually pinpoint a recent salient example of what would actually happen if you actually raised taxes, right? So they had to make vague threats to their fiscally reformist colleagues that, if you're not careful, things could go wrong. But when pressed as to what exactly would go wrong, they usually just couldn't give much of a concrete prediction. So in the end, they just always came back to it's just morally wrong. And as you can imagine, saying something is morally wrong is not a necessarily winning argument in politics, right? Like, politicians are not known for being the most moral creatures in the world, and so when the main strength of your argument is simply that something is morally wrong, they're almost always going to find some way to dance around it if they actually need to increase taxes. Now, you contrast that with the tone of the anti-tax arguments that you see emerging in the early Qing, and you immediately notice the different urgency in their tone. Like, early Qing arguments against raising taxes are pretty much almost uniformly of the following variety, which is, actually, we now know, we used to think that, morally speaking, raising taxes was dubious and was problematic, and we suspected that it would lead to negative consequences. We didn't quite know what they were at the time. Well, now we know, right? Why do we know? Because the Ming just collapsed a couple of years ago, and we think the Ming was killed off by peasant rebellions that were triggered in response to tax hikes. Right, so they immediately, after the collapse of the Ming, pretty much all the Chinese literati in the country coalesce around this dominant narrative of what are the causes of Ming collapse, and they come together to form this dominant mainstream narrative that blame Ming collapse on three major factors. Right, one was moral decay of the late Ming literati. The second was eunuchs, and the third was tax hikes. So immediately, right, the tone changes. Right, previously the tone was simply raising taxes is morally wrong. Now the tone is raising taxes is not just morally wrong. We know for a fact that, based on the Ming example, if you raise taxes beyond a certain red line, that tax increase is going to kill you right away. And as you can imagine, saying something is going to kill you is a vastly more powerful political argument than just saying something is morally wrong. So what I think really happened was, in the early Qing, there was a rapid coalescence around an ideologically reflective narrative of Ming collapse that squarely pinned Ming collapse on tax hikes, and that produced in the minds of early Qing elites a certain kind of fiscal red line based on late Ming tax levels, beyond which they thought, okay, the minute that the Ming stepped past these fiscal boundaries, the peasants began to rebel, and we, for our own self-survival, have to stay on the southern side of that red line. Now, that, I think, is what happened after the Ming-Qing transition and the early constructing dynasty. So the one question is, why do I call that an ideological narrative instead of just like a rational response to Ming collapse? Well, the thing is, if modern historians argue about Ming collapse, they will never coalesce around that particular position. That position is probably still held by some, perhaps not so large portion of Ming Ming historians. But there are also plenty of other positions. Some people have argued explicitly the opposite, that the Ming collapsed because of high tax, because of low taxes, because it lost the ability to kind of offer famine relief to impoverished peasants once there was a major natural disaster in the early 17th century. And then others would still say that, frankly, the taxes were just not terribly relevant either way. So the thing is that if you look at Ming collapse from kind of like a neutral position, what you would expect is you would expect people to splinter around a number of possible semi-plausible positions, of which one of them might be high taxes. But that, to the modern historian, that doesn't seem like necessarily the most powerful and obvious explanation. Now, instead, what you see in the early Qing is within pretty much like 10 years of Ming collapse, I traced down every single writing that I could find, whether at court in memorials or privately amongst the general population, and pretty much without exception, every single person begins blaming Ming collapse on taxation. So everyone just buys in, and these are people spread across the entire country, like north, south, east, west, inside the court, outside the court, titled, non-titled. Everyone coalesces around this narrative, which strikes me as not something that you would get from people who are kind of observing something neutrally and dispassionate. Instead, it strikes me as kind of like an ideologically inflected moment of post-crisis trauma and post-crisis kind of like therapeutic consensus building. The same thing happens after pretty much most major crises in human history, by the way. Like the Great Depression produced a brief moment of consensus amongst all kinds of scholars. The 2008 financial crisis produced a brief moment of consensus amongst a lot of macroeconomic scholars, who otherwise would never see eye to eye with each other. So what I think was actually happening was the previous Confucian hostility to taxation, which had not been politically weaponized, created a certain kind of like framing effect that basically made all these Confucian scholars in the early Qing, made them cognitively conducive to interpreting Ming collapse through the lens of this pre-shaped ideological bias that made them think taxation was dubious and morally wrong. And so that produced a dominant, usable narrative in their minds, a lesson to them that the Ming collapsed because of high taxes, and they produced this within like 10 years. I really think that had they approached the collapse from kind of like a more neutral perspective, they never would have coalesced so quickly around that one position. So I think like the early Qing coalescence around this one narrative is an ideologically reflected cognitive bias story, in which basically there's a framing effect, and the framing effect produces, in the aftermath of a massive crisis, it produces a usable narrative quickly, and you see this happen over and over in human history. But then, so that begs a second kind of question, which is, well, okay, this is possibly, depending on how much you buy my story, perhaps a plausible interpretation of events in the early Qing. Well, at some point, the shock of Ming collapse is going to wear out, and it's going to get weaker, right? So then, what explains the longevity of the Qing refusal to raise taxes? And the interesting thing is, in fact, the Qing commitment to not raising taxes actually deepens over time. Right, so like in 1680, you could still propose to the population that you could still propose at court that we might raise taxes, and you would get shouted down, and you would get pushed back against, and the emperor might write a couple of like not so polite things to you, but you usually wouldn't get demoted right away, right? It was still something that was like possible to talk about at court, although it never really got off the ground as a matter of policy. By 1800. Right? The minute anyone tried to propose an increase to agricultural taxes, that person was not just immediately shut down. That person was almost always demoted automatically. So the institutional commitment to not raising agricultural taxes actually deepens over time. So this demands explanation beyond the initial shock that created this ideological narrative. And here, one of the interesting things that I rely on to argue that part of the narrative, is that apart from being the only major Chinese dynasty to never raise agricultural taxes, the Qing is also the only major dynasty to never do a land survey. Now, land surveying is pretty much the Chinese imperial state's only way of kind of accurately measuring the overall size of the economy. Now, once you kill off land survey, you basically effectively kill off any possibility of producing what you might call authoritative information on what exactly was the actual size of your economy. And this is one thing that I argue throughout the book, which is that high politics don't run on quote unquote common sense of the world. High politics run on manufactured information that has to be authoritatively kind of like imprinted with a seal of approval by the government. And once you take that away, right, you can't actually produce the information necessary to overcome your empirical bias. But if your empirical bias is you think the peasants have a red line beyond which, like, and you step beyond that, they're going to rise up and kill you. Well, to overturn that, you have to actually argue against that perception of a red line empirically. You have to show that there's more tax capacity in the economy out there, and you have to show that through some kind of authoritative process. Now, if you don't do a tax survey, you can't actually engage in that kind of authoritative falsification of this empirical perception, which makes the entire enterprise of trying to argue against this dominant worldview just almost politically impossible for almost more than 2 centuries. Now, the interesting question then is, why does the team never do a land survey? And this is the interesting part. If you trace the arguments of why they stopped doing land surveys, the argument is that actually the peasants know that the only reason why we would ever do a land survey is when we want to raise taxes. We only do land surveys when we want to raise taxes. So therefore, if we want to credibly commit to them that we're not going to raise taxes, we also have to square off land survey, because once the minute they see a land survey, they think, okay, tax increase is coming down the road, we might as well just rebel right now to catch the state off guard. So if we really think that we can't risk any kind of fiscal aggravation of a deeply impoverished peasantry, then not only can we not raise taxes, we can't even do a land survey. So the same political logic that made them swear off taxation also made them swear off doing land surveys. But of course, when you don't do land surveys, and I'm not the only person who's made this argument, there's this guy in China called Zhou Jian who's made a similar argument. If you don't do land surveys, it's just politically impossible in the realm of high politics to actually argue for that for tax increases. So that's paired with the early Qing shock, where the early Qing shock produces a sentiment that we can't raise taxes. That sentiment becomes permanently baked into the Qing political psyche by the state's conscious blinding of itself to the overall size of its economy. And so by the 19th century, the state thinks that we're mired really, really deeply into this like super Malthusian crisis, because we think that the overall size of our rural economy has not grown since the early Qing, but we know that our population has grown rapidly. And so the peasantry must therefore be much more impoverished than they used to be compared to the early Qing. So if we think that we had no room to raise taxes in the early Qing, then certainly we can't do that right now. So the final thing that I want to address is, okay, now if we have the shock, if we have the institutional entrenchment through the legal banning of land surveying, the question then is, how do you eventually get out of this conundrum? Well, the interesting thing is, like, because this entire problem is essentially a problem of an empirical worldview, the only way you can actually get out of it is through some kind of empirical falsification. Right? And that empirical falsification comes in the form of like post-1880 returns of land survey. What happens is, after the Taiping Rebellion, because of all this depopulation in the lower Yangtze and then the repopulation in the 1870s, everyone knows in the lower Yangtze at least, all the land surveys, like all the land records that we previously had, are completely worthless at this point. So the state says, okay, we have to start doing a little bit of land survey. Once they do that, they discover to their surprise they actually have more arable lands than they have on the books, actually quite a bit more than they have on the books. So there begin to be voices at court saying that maybe we actually have more room to raise taxes than we actually thought we did. Then in the final decade of the dynasty, out of pure desperation, the dynasty decides, okay, maybe we can experiment one time with a 30% agricultural tax hike and see what happens. Once they do that, well, wonder of wonders, the peasants don't rebel. Why did the peasants not rebel? Because frankly, the taxes were so darn low before that a 30% tax increase to such a low base didn't matter for the vast majority of peasants in the country. Okay, so once that happens, everyone's like, oh my God, we actually can raise taxes and not be killed by the peasants. So by that point, this empirical spell is just broken. And the lesson that everyone learns after that, all the regimes that come after the Qing, is actually we have room to increase taxes on peasants and they won't kill us. So from that point onwards, everyone starts layering tax increases on the peasantry. By the 1920s, the agricultural tax rate is more than 3 times what it was in 1900, and by the early 1950s, the communists come in and learn the same lesson, that you can actually raise taxes on the peasantry. And by 1952, the tax rate on agriculture is more than 10 times what it was in 1900. And guess what? peasants pretty much still bear with it, because in the end, it's still only, even after all these increases, it's still only a 10% tax rate. They can actually tolerate that. So in the end, like if you created an empirical myth that binds your hands and makes you politically unable to raise taxes, the only way you shatter that empirical myth is basically through some kind of forced empirical falsification, and you finally get that in the final few decades of the Qing dynasty. So one final minute is, what exactly are the advantages of this account compared to the previous accounts? One is, well, first, it can actually explain what happens after 1840. It explains after why, in this moment of deep crisis post-Taiping, you still adamantly refuse to raise agricultural taxes, even though you're raising non-agricultural taxes like crazy, right? The second is, it also tells you what's different between the Qing and its predecessor dynasties, right? The Qing is the first dynasty to produce this kind of empirical narrative of a precise empirical red line of some 30 million taels per year, beyond which the peasantry can just not tolerate government taxation anymore and will rebel against you. So that was what actually did not exist in the Ming and the Song and so on and so forth, but you have it in the Qing. And finally, it can also explain why agricultural taxes were treated differently from non-agricultural taxes. Why? Because the early Qing narrative of rebellions killing off the Ming, these are peasant rebellions, right? So of course you think the rebellion against agricultural taxes, not non-agricultural taxes. And many points across the dynasty, officials expressly say this, right? We think that the peasantry cannot be taxed. We think the peasantry has no room to be taxed any further, but we think that merchants, we think that manufacturers, they have lots of surplus to be taxed. So Guofan says this more than once. When he's trying to justify, for example, the imposition of commercial taxes after 1860, right? So there's a firm narrative in the Qing that the peasantry is so impoverished and they can't be taxed more, but everybody else has surplus and we can tax them. And I think that entire narrative has deep roots in the way that they initially perceived the causes of Ming collapse. And that led to like a divergence in how they perceived the agricultural sectors of the economy versus the non-agricultural ones. So the main problems that plague the previous accounts of Qing fiscal weakness, I think, can all be kind of explained through this ideological account. And that's why I think this is not something that should replace those accounts, but it should be something that's kind of added to them and placed side by side, so that once you put all these things together, you have a relatively holistic account of the extraordinarily unusual fiscal weakness of China's final imperial dynasty. All right, so with that, I will just conclude my remarks and turn it over to Li, and we can perhaps go to the commentators. Right?
Okay. Thank you very much, Taisu. Ken, do you want to share your thoughts?
Okay, fine. So there's a lot to talk about here. So let me just dive right in. I think the book makes a couple of very important contributions to our understanding of Qing political economy and China's difficulties in responding to its various 19th century crises in particular. It should no longer be controversial that the Qing state was in many ways too small rather than too big, as in the old Oriental despotism trope. But it's surprising how common the older idea remains. And this book strongly reinforces the point that it's wrong. More distinctively, it's a real contribution, I think, to notice that what was really distinctive about the Qing was not so much a preference for low taxes in general, but a very strong preference for low agricultural taxes in particular. Though I am going to want to offer a couple of qualifications to this later. Third, I think Taisu is right to say that rationalist explanations on both the demand and the supply side cannot fully explain this commitment to very low agricultural taxations, especially once we get to the end of the 18th century, and it becomes increasingly clear that state capacity is inadequate in various key areas. And fourth, I agree with the methodological point that in looking beyond purely rationalist explanations, it's less fruitful to look to universalist psychological claims like loss aversion than it is to look to culturally specific ideological ones. But that within that realm of ideological explanation, a simple nod to Mencian notions of benevolence is inadequate, since the Mencian inheritance did not stop the Song from taxing much more heavily, or the Ming from taxing at least somewhat more heavily. The idea that a false belief that raising agricultural taxes would quickly lead to rebellion took root in the aftermath of the Ming collapse and was crucially important to this prolonged policy is at least plausible, though here I think much remains to be proven. And I haven't read as many of these accounts as Taisu has, but I was very struck he actually quotes from the Ming Shi, which is after all an authoritative statement. And the passage actually begins by listing disasters, famine, and starvation first, and then only later gets to taxes. And of course, we do know that the disasters, starvation, and famine were made worse precisely by budget cutting and by the laying off of people like Li Zicheng. Lastly, I think it is quite likely that Qing fiscal weakness had something to do with the way in which a late 18th century economic slowdown turned into sustained crisis, and therefore to at least one side of the so-called Great Divergence. And it certainly had something to do with the limits of early attempts at catch-up in the dynasty's last several decades. So starting, let's say, from 1840 on. So in short, there's a great deal to praise here and a great deal to build on. So now to various caveats. One issue here, I think, is the book's exclusive focus on the Qing period as one in which the fiscal system falls apart, rather than looking at the broader Ming-Qing period as one in which fiscality took a huge step backward with the implementation of what Richard von Glahn, who's sitting right here, has called the providential state, rather than the synergistic fiscal state of Song and Yuan. The Ming founding is in fact barely mentioned in this book, and it's a pretty dramatic turning point in Chinese history. Now, it's true that the Qing tax even more lightly than the Ming, but still, in quantitative terms, the shift in the early Ming is quite stunning, right? Per capita total revenue, if you convert all revenue into grain, Ming revenues in 1435 to 49 are a mere 19% of 1055 to 59 levels. And the form of that revenue had shifted from being 81% in coins in the mid 11th century to being 87% in grain, which of course makes you a heck of a lot less nimble. Meanwhile, the institutional changes wrought at the beginning of the Ming by Zhu Yuanzhang, which aimed at decommercializing the economy and at supporting the state mostly through in-kind taxes and corvée, had wrought damage, reinforced by the Ming never providing a remotely adequate money supply that imposed profound limitations on subsequent efforts at fiscal reform. It is true that you eventually get a late Ming boom, and a lot of this gets reversed, but I don't think all of it ever gets reversed.
No.
And so it's true that there were tax reform efforts in the Ming, most notably under Zhang Zhuzheng, and that starting in the 1570s, they included some significant agricultural tax hikes and efforts at fiscal rationalization. But again, I don't think they came close to making up for what had happened earlier. And it's true that Qing agricultural tax policy was even more immobile than Ming, with serious land tax increases only characterizing the dynasty's final 15 years rather than its final 70. But of course, how long the dynasty held on was at least in part exogenously determined, right? So that kind of comparison is inherently a shaky one. It's not that Taisu is wrong to say that there are Qing-specific factors at work here, and he's definitely right to point to a much stronger intellectual / ideological consensus against raising land taxes in Qing time. But I think once we recall the early Ming discontinuity in actual practices, then the link between ideology and the big story of imperial Chinese fiscal history becomes significantly weaker. And thus the centrality of psychological reactions to the trauma of Ming collapse is also weakened as an explanatory factor. It should, I think, be seen as having helped to perpetuate and restore, after the brief experiments of the late Ming, a set of fiscal arrangements that were, at least from our retrospective perspective, highly problematic, and that's very important. but I don't think they can be seen as the absolute center of the big story, because I do think the Ming turning point really has to get it equal play. And if what Taisu's ideologically centered story does help explain is the slowness with which the Qing abandoned this Ming-Qing fiscal system, then I think he should say more about another transitional moment that gets relatively short shrift in the book. And here I fully understand the book is long already. There are reasons why you don't want to add still more. But along with the early Ming getting passed over relatively quickly, the Qianlong Jiaqing transition at the end of the 18th century also gets passed over very quickly. And after all, there was a significant fiscal reform and increase in formal agricultural levies in the 1720s and 30s. And for most of the rest of the 18th century after that, a demand side rationalist explanation had some traction, right? Revenues were indeed stagnant, but they were perfectly adequate until the triple shock of the Second Jintran War and the rise of Heshan in the 1770s, and then the enormous costs of the White Lotus Rebellion in the 1790s, which were themselves in large part the result of Heshan's corruption. So essentially, the fiscal inaction that we really have to explain is that of approximately 1799 to 1853. And for agriculture specifically, arguably until 1901. At any rate, circa 1799, it was abundantly clear that the state's ambitions and its resources were out of alignment. So it's crucial to understand why Jiaqing's reforms overwhelmingly took the form of retrenchment rather than of state building. And why, to the extent that the state does build its fiscal and other capacities in the half century or so between 1799 and the Taiping Rebellion, it's entirely through increasing commercial revenues and sale of degrees. One should remember that the choice to emphasize retrenchment was not made entirely on fiscal grounds. And as Wang Wensheng has shown, and is also very consistent with what Tuan Huiseng has said, it's also done on the grounds that A, the state under Qianlong was trying to do some things that were either a waste of time, oppressive, and or counterproductive, e.g. sweeping up lots of harmless folks and harmless forms of piety in its search for dangerous sectarians. B, on the limited capacity of the emperor himself and his top set of aides to keep tabs on so many state projects at once. And the revelations about how much Heshan had kept true information from the emperor, and those revelations were also a kind of shared trauma, I think, reinforced the case for retrenchment, and revelations about the scale of corruption that had flourished under Heshan certainly made it harder to argue that the state needed to increase extraction rather than to reduce the famous waste, fraud, and abuse. But there's enough still left to explain about the strong reliance on retrenchment when it was also obvious that state capacity was weak, that I think Taisu's focus on the discourse of absolute practical necessity for low agrarian taxes also has a significant role to play. I just want to dislodge it a little bit from the center here. I'm particularly intrigued here by the way in which, by the late 18th century, that discourse had come to be buttressed by a set of quasi-Malthusian assumptions, i.e. that the reason you couldn't raise taxes without provoking rebellion was that people were already impoverished by population growth, far outstripping land reclamation, a misunderstanding that was undoubtedly reinforced, as Taisu argues, by the absence of land surveys that would have shown how much new land had been reclaimed. There's a lot of important intellectual history to unpack here, and Taisu, I think, does us a major favor by pointing out that there was a lot of quasi-Malthusian talk about land hunger, even in the early Qing, before the population tripled, so that we shouldn't see the prominence of such discourse at the end of the 18th century as simply a response to reality. And in fact, we could go further back, and there's a lot of this quasi-Malthusian talk in the Northern Song, right? When population to land ratios are probably at their most favorable ever. And again, while such discourse long predates the Qing, there is much to be said in favor of the idea that the Ming collapse helped reinforce it with long-lasting effects. And indeed, I think one of the most important things Taisu does in this book is to point us towards an agenda for research in the history of late imperial economic and not just fiscal thought and its ideological underpinning. So let me close here with a few questions, which I think Taisu doesn't really address, but he shows us the importance of addressing them. So this is both a kind of mild critique, but also an appreciation of the new territory that we're moving towards. So first, as Taisu points out, one reason why the perceived Malthusian crisis wasn't real, in addition to the fact that lots of land had been reclaimed, was that land productivity had increased very significantly through the extension of irrigation works, the application of more fertilizer, including new varieties of fertilizer, and so on. And the puzzle here is that people were certainly aware of those changes on a retail basis, certainly on their own land or that of their neighbors, or through the commendations they had seen for local gentry who led irrigation projects, as well as through agricultural manuals, which talked about these things ad nauseum. So I think one question we have to ask is, how widespread was this awareness? And why are key political actors and writers seemingly either unaware of the challenge it poses for a Malthusian narrative or unwilling to make that point? Is the answer here, as Taisu suggests it is for fiscal thought, that paradigms just don't get dislodged by accumulating contrary evidence until there's also some major shock? Or is there something else going on here? In a similar vein, Margarita Zanassi has shown us that while the late Ming and Qing thinkers did think of much of the empire as territories with severely limited prospects for growth, thus making frugality essential, they were also well aware of the lower Yangtze as a different kind of world in which sustained growth was very much possible, and therefore spending, both public and private, could be a virtue. What she doesn't really resolve, and in part, in that case, it's because it's a short book, was whether this thinking was really limited to Jiangnan, or whether there was any awareness of the possibility of another such place existing elsewhere. So for instance, in the Pearl River Delta, where one would have thought that this should have been obvious from simple observation of what was going on. And if there was awareness that Jiangnan didn't have to be the only example of a place where growth was possible, then again, we have a real puzzle as to why that knowledge doesn't translate into some kind of advocacy. Third, the period in which quasi-Malthusian thought seems to become especially strong, namely the early 19th century, is also, as Taisu notes, a period in which there is increasing interest in encouraging migration, including, I would note, an unprecedented interest in the positive possibilities of non-agricultural migrants, loggers, miners, etc., rather than simply viewing them as ruthless rascals whom you better keep away from the frontier before they cause trouble. What's the exact timing of this rethinking? And how is it linked to the entrenchment and then the eventual dethroning of this Malthusian discourse, at least the emigration part of which is clearly not a sudden late 19th century phenomenon, the way the willingness to tax agriculture more is. Fourth, and perhaps most important for Taisu's argument, there's a crucial unstated assumption in the discourse that assumes that tax increases will lead to peasant uprisings. And that is that either one of two things, either that who pays a tax is the same as who ultimately bears its burden, so that many commercial taxes, which actually fell on peasants who bought and sold in competitive markets, nonetheless just don't count in this discourse. Or the other possible assumption is that while the speakers may have understood that tax burdens may not ultimately
Mhm.
fall where they initially fall. They thought that ordinary people didn't understand this, and therefore taxes on agriculture will get the peasants riled up, other taxes will not. Which, if either of these things, did people believe?
Mhm.
And again, since some people clearly did understand that that wasn't true,
Mhm.
as with much of the discussion of salt taxes and later the legion taxes make clear, why does it seem to have had no impact on the staying power of the discourse that Taisu describes? Okay, I've gone on long enough, maybe longer than I should have, but that's by way of saying that this is a really stimulating book. I'm not sure that it actually does explain what it aims to explain, but it definitely helps. And it gives us a great deal to think about as we try to push further.
All right.
So
That's
we are all in its debt.
Well, thank you. That's all I can hope for.
Okay, Ken, thank you very much for sharing a lot of thoughts. I'm sure, those, especially some of the major arguments you have highlighted, will continue to inspire a lot of new scholarship as well as some of the continuing debates. Thank you very much. Manny, please go ahead.
Thanks for inviting me to this, and it's been a pleasure to read this book. There's obviously Taisu and I use very different methods, but nonetheless, I have found very similar thoughts and ideas in his book and to mine. So I have wondered about, especially the approaches he takes or the focus on the ideology, which is something I very much in agreement with. I think there is, just like Ken just mentioned, there is enormous space for more of the intellectual history or economic thought and to be in this discipline right now. I learned a lot, and I also got familiar with all these paradigms in the history discipline, which I'm not as of an expert in, and also I found it's like very Taisu made a great effort in trying to also incorporate the concepts in behavioral economics or cognitive bias framing effect, which is a great sign of intellectual curiosity, but also an effort to try to bridge different disciplines. And also I found his world history, like all these comparisons he makes, is highly useful and also very well done. So I made some notes on this as well. On this, his point about the horizontal comparisons between China and other early modern regions is just not really done at all compared to the more oftenly done comparisons such as the China versus Europe or England. I also think it's very much true. I think my own research will probably do a lot of comparisons will be going beyond the simple comparison between the China and Europe as well. Even though we would probably doing it statistically, different methods, but the underlying idea is actually the same. I think the use of Beijing China comparison, this is very satisfying. I think my own research is trying to make some of the same points. There is like a change in addition to something that we know we're familiar with, a constant, right? And so in this case, so Taisu exploits this change in the term of the mainstream transition, which then have some explanatory power in addition to the traditional Confucian idea in the discourse. So I think all of that is very nicely done, and I liked it a lot. I mean, this is amazing work linking intellectual history to economic history, and the intellectual history part is very expertly done. Viewed by viewed by an economist, but it's definitely something I think is just not seen very often, but it shows like great promise. So then I'm going to talk about my like 5 sets of comments, or begin with mostly just this is actually not your book exactly, but just a general discussion about fiscal, the issue of having low tax in China. So I think so a lot of this discussion so far is about the taxes are low and why it's low. But my question is, it's not exactly demand-based, but this is more a question about, so why do we care in this particular case? I think that in European economic history, a lot of this is because the state and transitioned into a mode where it actively finances public goods that is useful for further growth. But in this case, I think, and it would be very hard to see, maybe after late 19th century, there's some change in that regard, especially after the early 20th century. But up until then, it looked like the state was just not in a position or to finance any of those goods that can be linked to economic growth. So I think much of the book also in this larger literature is mostly about famine relief, which is important, but this is still like part of the traditional state, and it's not going to create economic growth, sustain the economic growth, which I mean, so I think this is kind of important because thinking about the reason why people might be willing to provide be taxed more. One of the reasons is because they can eventually benefit from it. And one way to create this and to create this positive feedback loop, it will be the state has to actually invest in good, worthwhile activities. So one of this could be, I guess, mass schooling, even though there's research is unclear if there is actually link or not between schooling and further growth, but that would be example, right? And then there will be other type of infrastructure you can actually invest in which generate future returns. But I think without talking about this, it is not as useful to talk about the low tax as a problem, as an economic problem in the late imperial China. So I think this is, it seems to me it would be important to discuss like the purpose, the nature of the problem more carefully. But this is not just your book, but I think it's in general, this discussion is useful, is necessary, right? So why is this, or maybe, without a transition to a new understanding of what the state should do, or even collecting more tax is not going to create a drastically different counterfactual for the economic situation in late imperial China. Yeah, and then in fact, I think this could be why no one is as active in expanding the capacity of the state, because they haven't been aware of those possible things the state could do. And the second way, so you talk about capital accumulation, so especially in the keynote speech you give at the little conference we did. So I think this is a very important point. I always thought the capital accumulation is very important, and then people don't realize how much, how important it is, and how much less capital China had, like compared to Europe around the same time. But I think one thing though is that it doesn't have to be a thing that's done by the state. So perhaps something which is really lacking in the case of China, it was due to the disappearance of aristocracy seems like a long time ago. Yeah. And also the state has purposefully trying to keep the merchants in like a weak position, so it's not a political threat. So suppose if we allow the lords or the local merchants to independently build their capital stock, then I think it would be very different. So you don't have to make the case that the state will have to be the one to accumulate the capital. Yeah. So there will be some other possibility, and the state, if they were tolerant of those other forces, economic forces, then even without expanding the fiscal capacity, you would still achieve the capital accumulation. So I think that you would think of this case as like a 19th century Germany. They were having those lords, and they were actually the ones to build the schools instead of the state. Okay, so then okay, so we only just get to the third point. So I was trying to finish soon, like maybe in 5 or at most 10 minutes. But my third point is about so the consideration about the subsistence or the quasi-Malthusian narrative. So I think in this regard, it might need some more careful calculation. So the thing is, taking 10% of a low surplus, like, is very different from taking 10% of like a much higher surplus, like the total, when the total include a smaller surplus. So I think it needs some careful thoughts on this, because it cannot just be a one-on-one comparison. You have like 10% of like song, but according to like steel robbery, that's like $1,000 US. That's a lot more than, a much lower number he gives for the later time. So I think that does need some to be addressed a bit more carefully. And then also is about fertility. I'm actually surprised by not mentioning this. I mean, it's still the same thing as a Susan theory, but it's different in the sense that so fertility can be endogenously determined by these fiscal policies, right? So households does engage in producing more population under this new policy. I guess the combine all taxes into one, the commitments to just the land taxes. So it is true, and also just that itself can create some vicious cycle, because once there are enough people, it will become much harder to tax, because you will be squeezing something out of much less. So I wonder if you have some way to isolate this mechanism, and because it will be independently true in this case, because you're talking about the entrenchment of a certain narrative, but then there is the separate mechanisms obviously going. It's going to be shaped by the previous fiscal policies, and it's going to subsequently affect the space available for future policies. So the examples you make of those later policies was made in a very different environment after like major disasters, or Typhoon Rebellion got rid of much of a population. Also the Great Famine in West China. So it's not fully comparable. So I do think, yes, so that's something I think maybe it's worth mentioning more. I don't know how exactly we can do this, but it seems like the Malthusian it varies across time, and that is something maybe it was mentioning a bit. I talks about the changes in the fiscal policy. And then the first point is, I think it's just about the late Qing trauma. Ming trauma, it talks about. So I'm doing a lot of cultural economics. So I mean, this part, I'm just also narratives as well. So to me, this appears to be some kind of a tacit decision made by different elites at the time. And then, so just to to put together this narrative that can provide some explanation for their own problem, like the trauma, or they have trouble understanding why Ming just went away. So it's for their own purpose. You mentioned the stereotypic purposes, but also isn't that it's also because you're not supposed to say any good thing about Ming, because that's the Manchu, and right. So then does that also provide some additional incentives for those elites to blame the government for those issues? So to me, that in that case, this is actually some tacit, or you can say it's like some coalition forming behind this narrative. This is part of the reason why it's been so resilient throughout the chain. And so if we set aside this for a moment, then I think it's just some of the same questions in all the studies, such as how this narrative survived, why is this narrative preferred to other narratives, how is that transmitted, was that from like parent to child or teacher to student, or was that through some other mechanisms? So I mean, I think in cultural economics, we have kind of had one theory about this is mostly through parental transmission, right? So it's like about but that's just one of the many theories out there. And I think I'm glad you mentioned this in the beginning speech about it's more like an activated some of the older knowledge, like something already there in Confucianism, but it's just getting like evoked. I think that they already explained some of my questions, because I had this question before about if this is an interaction or it's like an activation of the existing memory or ideology. And then, yeah, so I think I basically said that already about, this is just politically expedient to say that the Ming was responsible, the government was responsible for this, because that is going to make Ming looks bad, and then they're going to elevate the position of the Qing dynasty over them even more. So this is just going to be a popular narrative. And this is actually naturally leads to my last point about the political behavior of the Han officials at the time. Because it looks like they were being particularly risk averse, and you also mentioned the absence of any reform in the Qing is unusual. So I've been wondering that one of the reasons why this is so didn't happen is because they felt this political pressure, which is more than before. So this has made them more careful than their predecessors in other dynasties. So I guess this is a bit of a mental repression point, which I've worked on as well. But in your particular case, it just seems to be it seems to provide some partial explanation, because otherwise, so first, why is this being punished more than other dynasties? And then secondly, why this official seems to just take extra caution in much more so than before. So maybe say something about the absence of this reform and the possible explanation that goes into the composition of the political officials and the high level officials at the time, and maybe look at other areas. It's just in general there's a lack of reform in the Qing time, not just the tax reform. The agents, political agents at the time might just have that different behavioral mode than other times, and this will just be a particularly unfortunate case that the risk conversion, the self-preservation of these officials have led to a particularly bad consequence that has lingering effects on this on the late period. Yeah, I think this is all I have to say. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Melly. Taisu, I think depending on how much more time we can have, probably about another 25-30 minutes or so. In the interest of time, I know you want to respond to some of the comments, I think, from Ken and Melanie, but also I think I'm going to suggest that probably you can ask the audience on your end and see whether they want to add more questions, so you can respond to some of them together instead of just focus on what have already been asked. Is that?
I think this one actually.
Are people there want to ask?
Well, so most of them had to run out at 7 o'clock, but they're Richard Bonglan still here in our guys.
Okay, that's fine. Then you can respond to some of the. I don't think you need to respond to every one of them, all the questions, but you can highlight some of them. Then we can see whether people in the audience have other questions to add. Go ahead.
So
I will give you 5 minutes first, and then you can, if you have more questions, you can answer more.
Hi, yeah, this is Richard Bonglan from UCLA. Hi. I just want to make a couple of comments, since I haven't actually read the book, and
Detail.
that never stops me from commenting, of course. But I would reiterate a point that Ken made, that I think the ideological shift is taking place in the Ming. I mean, there may be, of course, new arguments in the Qing to reinforce that shift, but the shift is taking place in the Ming. But I would also want to emphasize that this shift that we're talking about is actually a rejection of Zhu Yuanzhang and his vision of political economy, which goes much more back to Chen Shi Huangdi's ideas, not particularly Confucian at all. But both, of course, are repudiating the Song model in very different ways. Another point I just wanted to raise is, when you raise this idea of the state should not or the emperor should not compete with the people, that's actually directed at commercial taxation, not agricultural taxation. And of course, what is interesting about this, what I would call the Ming Qing, late Ming and Qing model, the providential state, is that it believes in low taxation, but taxation only of agriculture, because agriculture is the only genuine source of wealth, for the state as well as the people. If you tax commerce, in the view of this political economy, you are actually creating the wrong incentives. You're encouraging people to do more commerce to pay the taxes that you're extracting from them. So they're in an interesting bind where yes, we're only going to tax agriculture. We're not. We're going to keep the agricultural taxes low, but we're not going to tax commerce as an alternative which of course is the opposite of the Song model.
Yeah, exactly.
And the Song, in fact, does freeze land taxes. No, from the very beginning, all the taxation, I mean, it's enormous tax increase, but it's all in commercial and consumption taxation. And then, capitation taxes and things like that. But the basic land tax actually remains, and then the other sort of thing that I think is interesting, and hasn't been raised here, but in the Song, there's a big objection to the monetization of taxation, and that's exactly what Zhu Yuanzhang himself, wants to get rid of. Right, it goes back to in-kind taxation of person and so forth. And what I find interesting in Ming and Qing is, despite all of this rhetoric for low taxation of agriculture, there doesn't seem to be any objection to the monetization of taxation. And that, I think, reveals a different economic universe than the Song, and is kind of interesting, given that we would think that the opposition to commercial taxation would also include opposition to monetization of taxation, but it does not.
Thank
Hi. Also, with the important caveat that I have not yet read the book. Oh yeah, I'm Aaron Glasserman. I'm a historian, currently a postdoc at Princeton University Center on Contemporary China, and was also here at the Economic History Workshop. A question about the use of the term ideology, and it struck me in your comments that it seemed like you were looking mostly at how the Qing dynasty, the ruling elite, had their own view of the world and recent history, and were in some ways constrained, or their decisions were shaped by it, which certainly makes sense to call that ideology. But there's another sort of more cynical or instrumentalist understanding of ideology. Well, it could be false consciousness, but also as a kind of construct imposed on the people who are ruled, and that could happen both from the sort of the dynasty and the court on the people at large. It could also be the dynasty on the gentry at large, right? And so I'm wondering then, to what extent do we see, in addition to the ruling elite being persuaded that we need to be careful about taxation, but also seeking to promote this as a kind of elite discourse through, I mean, of course, a lot of earlier generations of scholarship have looked at the sort of turn of the early the 18th century emphasis on the return to sort of, or the embrace of Neo-Confucianism. Maybe that could help situate those intellectual shifts as a kind of active promotion, not just in a kind of social conservatism on the part of the gentry elite, but also a sort of effort to get them on the same page, to build that consensus that you sort of diagnose and interrogate.
All right, thank you. Great. So,
So I know the Zoom chat room also has probably some question. You can take a look. I want to actually add my own quick thought on this. I love the book and all of your books. But also, as you know, I have been studying the kind of local, especially governments and especially judicial administration. So one of the most pressing concerns for especially local administrators, but also some of the ministers, even including some of the Qing emperors, was how to finance the local governments. So with the low tax, so continuing for, I don't know, as you have argued, for more than 2 centuries. So what were the I guess implications of that kind of fiscal policies for the daily or everyday management of local governments, and to what extent they really justified, the avoidance of almost a dynastic collapse at the expenses of actually having a healthy budget for the local governments? Because I mean, for example, in my my next book, manuscript, I have identified several thousand of legal advisors were paid by local officials. Apparently, the money had to come from somewhere, right? Either from taxes or from stipend, what's the Yanglian virtual nurturing stipends, but still, they had to come from the state budgets one way or another. So I think there was, on the one hand, you highlighted very well the kind of ideological importance of certain kind of arguments, discourses in shaping decision makers' mentality, their rationale, or even actual policies adopted by them. But also, on the other hand, they had to deal with the daily reality of administering of a huge empire, both in terms of population size and also territorial size. So how were they actually going to make a fine balance without actually causing the dynasty to collapse one another? I mean, it's not just the fear of dynastic collapse because of the high taxes that was not the only concern, right, for them, right?
Yeah.
The actual collapse of the government itself could be a serious danger to them as well. So if you can, I would hear your elaboration on that.
Right. So we don't have that much time. So let me just answer a very small subset of the questions that I got. And thank you to everyone, especially Ken and Melanie, for these excellent questions. So let me just say a couple of things. One is on Richard's point, which I actually this is a quite critical point, on how should you actually build a commercial tax, where the Sung tries to do that basically far earlier than almost anybody else tries to do it. The Europeans followed in the 16th, 17th centuries. The Ottomans tried this in the 19th century. The Russians tried this in the 19th century. The Japanese do this in the late 19th century as well, including in the Sung. So the Sung, I think you're exactly right. Like the formal land tax is locked right at the start of the dynasty, but the Sung has no moral qualms of layering basically like fees on top of the land tax on agriculture, right? So in effect, the actual collection, like the actual fiscal collection that was directly imposed on the peasantry, like I'm looking at the same sources that say like the Wang looks at for his various articles, and also looking at this like 历代户口田赋田地统计thing, and so there, if you trace it, like right before they begin to impose all the various kinds of commercial taxes and all the kinds of indirect taxes that, exactly as you say, become the bulk of their taxes later on, they actually for about 20 years they layer a couple of fees on agriculture, and they use that money to pay for
on households.
On households, right? On households. But
I mean, it's the same people.
It's the same people.
Yeah.
So like exactly. So like when I say agricultural taxes, I mean taxes directly levied on agricultural production, not land taxes as a formal category, right? So that goes up, and they use that money to actually pay for the construction of the administrative bureaucracy that they need to actually collect the commercial taxes, right? So there's an expansion of tax collection entities in the dynasty across the empire and the Sung to actually implement the collection of commercial taxes. And that's partially what makes the commercial taxes in the Sung actually run fairly well, because they actually managed to build a bureaucracy to actually do all of this. And this is pretty much the same thing that everybody else does, right? Like agricultural taxes almost always go up in a decade or two before commercial taxes really get up and running. Even the Russians, who by 1900 pretty much abandoned their agricultural taxes, increased agricultural taxes to pay for the bureaucracy that they need to have in the building of their commercial taxes. And this is another kind of like somewhat more subtle thing in which the Qing is actually just really weird, because in the lead up to the Lizian and all their late 19th century commercial taxes, not only do they not increase agricultural taxes, they start cutting it because of the Taiping and the destruction of the tax apparatus that was imposed by the Taiping. So they're basically they're trying to impose a new tax when their administrative capacity is basically being shrunk all the time. And so they have no new bureaucratic capacity to actually collect these taxes, which means the only way they can do that is by imposing like tax farming arrangements with local bureaucrats. No, I'm sorry, like with local gentry elites. And the amount of corruption and malfeasance that happens because of that is just astronomical right off the bat. And no one else does it in this fashion, because everyone knows it's just like you're really kind of like destroying your own fiscal credibility if you do this kind of thing. But the Qing somehow decided that it had to do this. On Ken's points, right? So the one thing that I would say, out of many of the core points that you put, and we can talk about these and something that's especially about the Qianlong Jiaxing transition, which I care a great deal. Like I really do care a great deal about. Two things. One is I think the Yuan Ming is critical. I do agree. Like the book is kind of like skims over the Yuan, but it talks about Zhu Yuanzhang's like strong aversion to various kinds. He goes back to in-kind collection, he rejects the Song model, and so on and so forth. But that said, like within a century of Zhu Yuanzhang's death, you start seeing basically the Ming court telling the provinces, okay, we need more taxes. Let's start to kind of like subtly reject the Hongwu model, and then let's start doing more tax increases. Like it's not until the 1510s that the central government begins to impose its own experimental tax increases. But 70 years before that, starting from around 1450, the provinces had pretty much been given the green light in the Ming to say, try to get more taxes and see what you can do, and they start imposing more agricultural taxes. So the Ming is consciously rejecting what they saw as the overly abusive Songyuan model of high taxes. That's completely correct. But at the same time, they're not doing what the Qing does. Instead, they're kind of going back to like the Tang model, right? Like Zhu Yuanzhang's ideal model is actually the Zhu Yongdiao system, all the way back in the Tang, right? So I still think, for me, that's qualitatively different than just like the absolute refusal to even consider agricultural tax hikes that you see in the Qing. I think the Qing really is a different animal. Finally, like the point about like retail knowledge, that's, I think, a critical point. One of the core points that I'm pressing is also in kind of like a theoretical way in this book is that I really don't think when you're running that large a country that you can make, like you can win arguments in higher politics on the basis of retail knowledge. Right, like, and this might be like a generalizable point that I try to test in other contexts, but I do think that in high politics, if you want to win arguments, the empirical, especially when you're going against the established mainstream conventional wisdom, your empirics have to be ironclad. And the only way to make your empirics ironclad is to have some kind of authoritative source. Like if you know Chen Hongmo goes down to Hunan and says, I observe higher productivity on the ground here, and he comes back to court and says, let's try to raise taxes on the basis of like my anecdotal experience down there, he's going to get shouted out of court within like 2 days of his memorial arrival at court, and then he's immediately going to get punished, because like that seems to everyone as like an unserious way of trying to pursue something that's extraordinarily sensitive. If you're going to touch that sensitive button, you better have like really powerful data like behind your back. And you know, like that kind of data in this kind of era really only comes from land surveys. When you kill off land surveys, you kill off that kind of politics. And so this is why like the entire latter half of the book basically tries to press this point that you know, like ideologies and high politics, ideological politics at the higher levels run on constructed monopolistic authoritative information instead of our direct information interaction with the real world. Like that's part of this overall construction of ideology that the state constantly engages in. So to Melanie, I think the core point that I would want to make is, you know, like, aren't you supposed to badmouth the Ming? I think you're supposed to badmouth the Ming. But the question is, how do you badmouth it, right? The contrast that I would want to draw here is, can contrast that with how everybody badmouthed the Qing after the Qing fell. But you would imagine, because you know the Qing increases agricultural taxes in the final dynasty, and then it collapsed. There's like an easy out there that you could point to that says, actually, they also collapsed because they increased agricultural taxes. But instead, once you get into the Republican era, which was not administratively stronger than the Qing by any measure, everyone says, actually, these late Qing idiots, why did they collapse? Because they collapsed because the state was too weak. And instead, our new paradigm has to be one in which the state is vastly stronger. And actually, the late Qing proved that we can actually raise taxes and not get killed. So let's use that to actually build a real state. We need a real state at this point, right? So the thing is, you know, like it seems completely impossible for that kind of thing to exist in the Ming, right? But if you look at how the Ming collapsed, it's not such an outlandish argument to make the argument that really, as Ken was also saying, the Ming possibly collapsed because they just didn't have the money to offer famine relief. And that would say the lesson, if you wanted to draw lessons and badmouth the Ming, you could say, well, they were irresponsible fiscal managers. They didn't have the guts to actually get more money when they really needed to. They starved the peasantry. They couldn't offer relief to the peasantry, and they died. Right, so our lesson drawn is that we have to have a stronger tax base, we have to have better famine relief. That ought to be the lesson, right? Instead, the lesson they draw is we just have to have low taxes, right? So there's a choice here. I think, you know, the need to badmouth the previous dynasty is universal, but you have some choice on how you actually badmouth the previous dynasty. And there, I think this.
Okay, so sorry, I injected one, but I think there's a big difference though between this type of these two narratives, because the first one, or the alternative one just proposed, that's more like incompetence. That's much more forgivable.
Yeah.
then
The,
molest.
the moral evil.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
but the thing is, like, incompetence of that level, like tolerating that level of suffering, that's also, you could say that's just moral evil. And in some ways, like, you could almost say, like, other parts of the narrative, when they say moral decay causing like late Ming collapse, they're actually pointing to what they perceive as administrative malaise in the late Ming. Like, the bureaucrats weren't doing anything, they were sitting there with empty talk about morality. You would almost imagine that kind of thing being conducive to a narrative that all your empty moralizing talk made you inattentive to the needs of the peasantry, and that's your real moral failure. So I think you can play it both ways here, plausibly, in a void, but on the ground, in reality, because of all their ideological conditioning to think of taxes in this negative fashion, what they came to was really the only option that was kind of politically viable to them. Then finally, on Aaron's final point, like what are ideologies? So I think of ideologies as basically, like the common definition of ideologies is just like a belief system. It's a set of mental shortcuts you take to make sense of the world. Otherwise, the world is completely incomprehensible because we don't have the mental firepower to actually process things empirically, piece by piece. We always make shortcuts, we jump, and the ideologies are when your jumps get systemic enough that they begin to coalesce into something that's actually kind of a holistic worldview. And so it's, like, it's both normative and empirical. For like an ideology to become fully weaponized, for me, it has to have that empirical component, actually being able to explain the outside world. Now, as you can say, that this can either be imposed top down or it can be self-driven. In this case, I'm mainly talking about the self-driven aspect because, frankly, I don't really think that Qing had the capacity to impose anything top down. In other contexts, you're completely right. Finally, on Lee's point, how are all these local bureaucrats actually financed? I think that's a really powerful point. My sense is that, yeah, these guys were all financed either by surcharges, actually almost primarily by surcharges, because if you look at the state budget, right, surcharges, like illegal surcharges, were pretty much about like 100% of formal quotas. Now we know that within the formal quota, 90% of the formal quota was spent on things like military spending and paying for the imperial household and so on and so forth. Only 10% of the formal quota actually went to paying the salaries of officials. But when you put that in context with the illegal surcharges, then it turns out that most likely that the actual amount of money flowing into local government coffers was something in the range of like 11 to 12 times what they were actually allocated under the official quotas. Now, once you think of it in that sense, their actual ability to pay for clerks, pay for runners, pay for these like basically pseudo lawyers that you write so eloquently about, begins to make a lot more sense. Because if you look at 10% of the formal quota, that's what 10% is like, 3 million taels a year, and so 4 million taels a year. That's minuscule. But you multiply that by 10 or by 10 or 11 or 12, and then you begin to see how at least the bare bones structure of a semi-functional local bureaucracy can actually emerge. But of course, at some point, it runs out of money because the population is just growing too fast. And at that point, like the decision really is, going back to the Qianlong transition, is that we can't grow the bureaucracy because we don't have more money. We absolutely cannot raise more money. So what do? Well, we begin decentralizing. We begin actually actively trying to encourage collaboration with local lineages. Up to that point, every single regime in Chinese history had always been somewhat wary and hostile to the idea of sharing power with local lineages. Post the Qianlong transition, the Qing state actually aggressively embraces a positive view that we actually should share power with local lineages. And it's really the only period in Chinese history where the state really like enthusiastically endorses a vision of like the state sitting side by side with these local lineages and sharing power at the locality. So I think that was how they eventually solved their problem in the 19th century.
Right. Just to follow up, has always been a question I have had for people when they discuss the state capacity based on either the formal tax revenue or whatever fiscal system they had, because as far as we know, not just in the Qing, but also in much the earlier time periods, the informal staff members, local governments always played a very important part of getting, keeping the government floating. So in a sense, the formal fiscal system might not be as demanding as in other countries, but I think that might be just part of the picture of how much revenue.
Exactly. So when I in the book, when I count the actual fiscal burden imposed on peasants, whenever possible, I include informal surcharges. And the interesting thing about the Qing is you have at various points in the dynasty, around 1720 is one point, around 1820 is one point, and then in 1907, you actually have somewhat decent estimates of what the informal surcharges actually amounted to. And the interesting thing is, you would expect them to grow over time as the dynasty gets larger if you buy into, for example, the Ma Rubin model, for example. But in fact, like informal surcharges stayed kind of pegged at roughly 100% of the formal quota across the entire dynasty. And I have various theoretical arguments I make in the book to explain why this is actually kind of plausible. So the informal surcharges weren't actually growing disproportionately to the formal quota, and that's the thing here. Right? So even if you count the informal surcharges, it's still an abysmally low tax state that didn't have enough money to actually pay for its own operation by the 19th century. All right, great. So we have like apparently 1 more minute. Do you want me to take like one question from the audience online?
Sure, and also if you want to address any of the questions in the chat room, feel free.
Yeah, I'm just reading the questions in the chat room. So I'm just like, with apologies to Nicholas and Patrick, I'm just going to take Yisu Mei, perhaps use Yisu Mei Lao's question, which is, does the explanation that I give have any relationship to state elite relations? So I think it has a lot, right? So there's an enormous amount of detail in the book on basically which way the kind of like informational and also kind of like conveyance arrow went between the state and the kind of literati. Now, the thing is, in most dynasties, the state plays a somewhat larger role in constructing what you might call ideological orthodoxy. In the Qing, because the state shrinks a lot, the state retains a lot of its like symbolic authority within the realm of intellectual orthodoxy, but it also begins to lose control over a lot of what's actually going on the ground in these like various elite places of learning across the country. So, for example, the Hanxue, Songxue distinction in the Qing, where basically the officialdom runs on Songxue, but like the literati at large runs on Hanxue. This is like a really crude. A really crude summary of pretty complex terrain, but no, that's kind of like the rough structure of the entire thing. That would not have existed, I think, in other dynasties, because the state would have had a bit more authority to actually manage the literati. In the Qing, like basically there's an entire world out there where all these like highly learned local scholars are just basically giving the middle finger to the state and saying like, we actually reject your entire paradigm and we want to build our own. And that actually becomes the dominant intellectual paradigm across most of the Qing. So I think like a lot of what's going on in the way that this ideology is being constructed as a bottom-up collective enterprise has to do with the fact that this is a dynasty in which the state does not have a ton of control over the intellectual motions of its elites. And so therefore, if you want to look at all this stuff, you can't just look at the state's maximums and the way that it issues edicts and so on and so forth. It's really a bottom-up process. And so you have to take official memorials as seriously as like private writings that you collect here and there. So it becomes a much larger enterprise. And partially that's my defense for explaining why this book is 400 pages. So
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Taisui, do you want to take any more questions, or that?
I think we have to run here because I think everybody wants to get to.
Okay, then I want to thank Taisui, Ken, Melanie, and all the people who have attended this talk. I think I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot, both from reading the book and also from the conversations. So thank you all for participating. And if you are interested, please either get in touch with me or subscribe to the WeChat public account. We will schedule more new book talks in the next few months as well.
All right,
thank you again.
Thank you so much, and good
thanks.
luck.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Ken and Melanie.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, bye.